It was a quiet Sunday night in one of the wealthiest zip codes in America. A night like any other, where the manicured lawns and towering palm trees of Beverly Hills stood as silent monuments to success and security. This was a world insulated from the harsh realities of life, a place where tragedy was something that happened to other people, in other places. The date was August 20th, 1989. The air was warm, the streets were still, but behind the opulent facade of one particular mansion, that illusion of peace was about to be irrevocably shattered. Inside the sprawling Spanish-style mansion at 722 North Elm Drive, the scene was anything but peaceful. The home, a symbol of the American dream achieved, had become a stage for an American nightmare. It was a scene of unimaginable horror, a vortex of violence that defied all reason. At 11:47 p.m., a frantic 911 call pierced the silence of the night. On the line, a young man, his voice a raw, primal scream, choked with a torrent of panic and grief. He was hysterical, his words tumbling out in a barely coherent flood. The dispatcher, trained for chaos, struggled to decipher the sounds of pure terror. He had just come home, he sobbed. He and his brother had gone to the movies and then to a food festival. But when they returned, they walked into a bloodbath. He had found his parents. Something terrible had happened. The dispatcher tried to calm him down, to get the details needed to send help. "What is your name?" she asked, her voice steady. "What is the address?" But the voice on the other end was lost in a storm of emotion, a wail of anguish that seemed to come from the deepest parts of his soul. Finally, through the sobs and gasps, a single, horrifying sentence cut through the noise. "They shot and killed my parents," he screamed. The young man on the phone was Lyle Menendez, aged 21, a student at Princeton University. His younger brother, Eric, just 18 and a promising tennis talent, was with him. The dispatcher could hear Eric's desperate, uncontrollable sobbing in the background, a gut-wrenching echo of his brother's panic. They were the privileged sons of a powerful family, now seemingly the tragic victims of a horrific crime. They claimed they had gone to see the summer blockbuster, trying to create a normal Sunday evening for themselves, only to return to a scene of unimaginable carnage. Within minutes, police were dispatched, racing towards the Elm Drive address. A call like this in Beverly Hills was rare. Officers braced themselves, unsure of what they would find behind the gates of the stately home. When the first officers arrived, they were met by the two brothers on the perfectly manicured front lawn. Lyle, though visibly shaken, was attempting to speak with the officers, while Eric was completely inconsolable, a crumpled figure of grief on the grass. They were distraught, the very picture of sons who had just lost their world. But inside, the scene confirmed their worst fears, and then some. Their bodies were found in the family's TV room, a comfortable den where they had been watching a movie and eating popcorn and strawberries. The room had been transformed into a gruesome execution chamber. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and gunpowder. It was a scene of utter devastation. Jose Menendez, 45, a self-made, hard-driving entertainment executive and CEO of Live Entertainment, was dead. His wife, 47-year-old Mary "Kitty" Menendez, a former beauty queen and dedicated homemaker, was also dead. The couple who had everything, wealth, power, and two handsome sons, had met a terrifyingly violent end. The sheer violence was extreme, shocking even for the most seasoned homicide detectives. This wasn't just murder. It was annihilation. Jose had been shot 6 times, including a final point-blank shot to the back of his head. Kitty had been shot 10 times, her body riddled with bullets, as she apparently tried to crawl to safety. It was a brutal, bloody massacre, an act of breathtaking rage. The term detectives would later use was overkill, The initial report painted a grim but confusing picture. The brutality suggested a professional mob-style hit. Jose had a reputation for being ruthless in business. But the scene was too chaotic, too messy. It could have been a home invasion gone horribly wrong, but detectives quickly noted there was no sign of forced entry. And incredibly, thousands of dollars in cash and expensive jewelry were left in plain sight. Wrapped in blankets on the lawn, the brothers told their story, their alibi. To the outside world, to the arriving media, and to the police in those first few hours, Lyle and Eric Menendez were the grieving sons, the unfortunate survivors of an unspeakable tragedy. They were the new heirs to a vast fortune, now orphaned and alone. No one could have guessed that the first cracks in their story were already beginning to show, or that the shocking truth lay hidden, not in the city's criminal underworld, but right there on the front lawn, concealed beneath a carefully constructed performance of tears and sorrow. On the surface, the Menendez family had it all. They lived a life of extraordinary privilege, the very picture of the American dream. Jose Menendez was a self-made man, a Cuban immigrant who had climbed the corporate ladder with fierce determination, the CEO of Live Entertainment. Kitty Menendez, his wife, was a former beauty queen. She was seen as a devoted mother who curated the family's public image. Their sons, Lyle and Eric, were handsome and athletic. Lyle was a student at Princeton. Eric was a talented tennis player. They appeared to be the golden boys of a golden family. But behind the closed doors, there were whispers of pressure, of Jose's immense expectations for his sons. He demanded perfection. The pressure to succeed was immense. The perfection was a performance, and the strain was beginning to show. No one could have known the darkness that lurked beneath the polished veneer. No one suspected that the bonds holding them together were frayed and poisoned by secrets. The shocking violence shattered an illusion. The murders would rip back the curtain on their private world, exposing a toxic reality of fear, control, and alleged abuse. In the aftermath of the murders, the Beverly Hills police found themselves at a dead end. The crime scene was pristine, with no signs of forced entry, suggesting the killers were known to the victims. With no murder weapon and no immediate suspects, the investigation floundered. But while detectives chased leads, Lyle and Eric Menendez began to live a new life, one unburdened by parental authority. They were now orphans, but they were also incredibly wealthy. As sole heirs, they controlled a fortune estimated at $14 million, the equivalent of over $30 million today. This vast sum included the Beverly Hills mansion, luxury cars, and Jose's lucrative business, Live Entertainment. The brothers had the keys to a kingdom, and they began spending that money with manic urgency. Just days after their parents' funeral, the brothers embarked on a lavish spending spree. Lyle purchased a brand-new black Porsche Carrera and a Rolex watch and invested in a restaurant. Eric hired a full-time professional tennis coach for $50,000 a year. Together, they burned through nearly $1 million in 6 months on clothes, trips, and parties. They were living like kings. The contrast between their supposed grief and their extravagant lifestyle was jarring. Relatives were shocked to find the brothers more concerned with accessing safe deposit boxes than with mourning. Their apparent lack of sorrow was a glaring red flag. The whispers started, spreading through their affluent social circle. How could two sons who claimed to have loved their parents seem so utterly untroubled by their brutal deaths? The break in the case came from Eric. Younger and more sensitive, he began buckling under the psychological weight of their secret. Plagued by nightmares and crippling anxiety, he felt an overwhelming need to unburden himself. On October 31st, 1989, he decided to confess, not to police, but to his therapist, Dr. L. Jerome Oziel, In a series of emotionally charged sessions, Eric laid the secret bare. Dr. Oziel, in a move of questionable ethics, recorded it all on microcassette tapes. These recordings captured the chilling details, the meticulous planning, the purchase of the shotguns, and the brutal execution of their parents. He laid the secret bare, a detailed roadmap to the crime. But the secret didn't stay in the therapy room. Dr. Oziel shared the explosive details with his mistress, Judalon Smith, allegedly to manipulate and control her. Terrified by Oziel's erratic behavior and the violent secret she now held, Smith began to fear for her own safety. Convinced the brothers might try to silence her, she made a fateful decision. In March 1990, she went to Beverly Hills Police and told them everything. Smith's testimony was the bombshell investigators needed. On March 8, 1990, police made their move. Lyle Menendez was arrested outside the family mansion. The news sent shockwaves through Beverly Hills. 3 days later, Eric, returning from a tennis tournament abroad, surrendered to authorities at the airport. The brothers' 6-month reign was over. The public was stunned. The story had all the elements of a Hollywood thriller: wealth, tragedy, and 2 handsome young men accused of the ultimate betrayal. As the brothers were charged with murder, the prosecution laid out a motive that was simple and chilling: pure, unadulterated greed. They had murdered their parents for money. It was a narrative that set the stage for one of the most sensational trials of the century. In the summer of 1993, the Van Nuys courthouse in Los Angeles became the epicenter of a media earthquake. The trial of Lyle and Eric Menendez was about to begin, and a fledgling network called Court TV was there to broadcast every moment live. This wasn't just a trial. It was the birth of a new kind of reality television. The combination of extreme wealth, Beverly Hills glamour, and the shocking crime of patricide proved irresistible. The proceedings transformed a horrific family tragedy into a national obsession, with millions of Americans tuning in daily, dissecting every piece of testimony and forming their own deeply held opinions. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Pamela Bozanich, presented their case with methodical, damning precision. Their message was simple and brutal. This was about greed. They painted a picture of 2 spoiled, sociopathic young men who, after years of enjoying a lavish lifestyle, grew impatient for their inheritance. To prove it, they meticulously detailed the brothers' extravagant spending spree in the months following the murders: Rolex watches, a new Porsche, expensive trips, and a down payment on a restaurant. The prosecution argued this wasn't the behavior of traumatized sons, but of cold-blooded killers celebrating their newfound freedom and fortune. Their narrative was clear. Lyle and Eric Menendez had executed their parents to unlock a $14 million estate. But the defense, spearheaded by the fiery and formidable Leslie Abramson, was about to detonate a legal and cultural bombshell. They unveiled a shocking counter-narrative that would turn the case on its head. This wasn't a murder for money, Abramson argued. It was a desperate act of survival, an escape. The defense claimed that behind the gilded facade of the Menendez mansion was a private hell of relentless psychological, emotional, and sexual abuse, perpetrated for years by their father, Jose, and enabled by their mother, Kitty. This wasn't a calculated hit for an inheritance. It was the tragic culmination of a lifetime of terror. Eric, the younger and visibly more fragile brother, was the first to take the stand. For 6 agonizing days, the courtroom and the nation watching at home were held captive. In harrowing, tearful testimony, he recounted a childhood devoid of love, filled instead with constant fear, humiliation, and control. He described in graphic, disturbing detail the alleged sexual abuse he suffered at the hands of his father, Jose, beginning when he was just a boy. He also painted a portrait of his mother, Kitty, as a deeply unhappy woman, herself a victim of Jose's tyranny, who battled depression and alcoholism and was ultimately unable to protect her sons. For many, Eric's raw, emotional account was profoundly convincing, shifting public opinion from condemnation to sympathy. Next, it was Lyle's turn. In stark contrast to his brother, the elder Menendez was more composed, articulate, and seemingly detached. This composure became a central battleground of the trial. To the defense, it was the hardened shell of a lifelong abuse victim, but to the prosecution, it was the cold mask of a sociopath. During a relentless cross-examination, Pamela Bozanich hammered Lyle on his inconsistencies and his apparent lack of emotion. She portrayed him as the domineering older brother, the true mastermind of the plot, who had manipulated his weaker, more impressionable brother Eric into participating in the murders. The nation held its breath as two separate juries, one for each brother, retreated to deliberate. The country was as divided as the jurors. Was this a case of greed or of fear? After weeks of deliberation, the answer came back fractured. In January 1994, the judge was forced to declare a mistrial. Both juries were hopelessly deadlocked. In Lyle's case, jurors were split between murder and manslaughter. In Eric's, they leaned more heavily toward manslaughter, but still couldn't reach a unanimous verdict. The defense's shocking abuse narrative had successfully planted reasonable doubt. The prosecution had failed to get a conviction. The retrial, which began in August 1995, would be a vastly different affair. The legal landscape had shifted dramatically against the brothers. Presiding Judge Stanley Weisberg made two crucial rulings that would seal their fate. First, he banned television cameras from the courtroom, plunging the proceedings out of the public eye and removing the element of public sympathy that had been so palpable. Second, and more devastatingly, he severely limited the defense's ability to present the abuse claims. He ruled that the theory of imperfect self-defense based on a history of trauma was no longer admissible. The defense could now only argue that the brothers feared for their lives on the exact night of the killings, a much higher and nearly impossible legal bar to clear. This time, there was only one jury for both brothers, and with the abuse defense neutered, there was no deadlock. The prosecution presented its streamlined case, focusing solely on the greed motive and the brutal nature of the crime. After a much shorter trial, the jury delivered its verdict on April 17, 1996. The court clerk's words echoed through the silent room. On all counts, for both defendants, guilty. Lyle and Eric Menendez were found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The saga that had riveted and divided a nation had reached its grim, legal conclusion. Spared the death penalty, they were sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences in prison without the possibility of parole. The jury spared their lives. Judge Weisberg formally sentenced Lyle and Eric to 2 consecutive life terms without parole. They were sent to separate prisons. For over 2 decades, they lived in different facilities, their bond severed by the system. In 2018, Lyle was moved to Eric's facility, the brothers reunited behind bars. The Menendez case left an indelible mark. Recently, a new generation on platforms like TikTok has rediscovered the case. Sympathy has resurged. So the ultimate question remains, was justice truly served? Did cold-blooded killers get the punishment they deserved, or were severely abused victims condemned by a system that failed to understand their trauma? The truth may sit somewhere in the murky space between extremes, forcing us to question what we believe about guilt, innocence, and the elusive nature of justice itself.